Hey everybody, it's Eric from epautos.com, the Libertarian car guy, I'm doing a little ride along here in this new Nissan Murano. Those of you who are familiar with the Murano may recall that it was one of the first kind of high-style crossover SUVs when it came out when was it? Way back in I think 2002 or 2003, something like that. I can't quite remember, but it pretty much launched this new class of high-style crossover SUVs, of which there are now a veritable horn of plenty to choose from. Murano, of course, refers to a kind of slick Italian glass to emphasize the stylish aspect of it. The new one here is even more stylish than the old one. It's got some neat touches, neat flourishes. They just dropped it off for me yesterday, so this is just the initial familiarization ride. I kind of like this sort of brushed metal stuff that they've got that swings around. It's kind of looks like clear-coated pewter. Kind of neat. I haven't seen anything quite like that before. It looks like it's got a carryover drivetrain, 3.5 V6, with an automatic transmission and all-wheel drive. But anyway, what I really wanted to talk about today was not so much this Murano, but rather what's coming up in just 2 days, and that is the 4th of July. I just posted a column up at the website entitled Changing of Our Guard, and as you can probably guess, that is the subject of the column. And what happened, in my opinion, after 1776, which was the real revolution, which didn't last very long, was that the British system was replaced by a new American system, by members of the colonial elite, including men like Alexander Hamilton, who got together in, and you won't read this in most history books, a secret conclave. Ostensibly, they met to modify or amend the Articles of Confederation, which were the law of the land after the successful conclusion of the War for Independence from Great Britain. But when they met with the deliberate, calculated, and entirely unauthorized object of replacing the Articles of Confederation with what Hamilton described as an energetic or vigorous document that would empower a new centralized authority, the very thing that most colonists thought they were getting rid of by waging a war of independence from Great Britain. And of course they succeeded. It was put on kind of hiatus briefly for a little while after it was enacted, simply by dint of the fact that the Federalists, of whom Hamilton was the lead representative along with Washington and Adams, became very unpopular for a short time, and Jefferson assumed the presidency as an anti-federalist, and this became the Democrats. And it was sort of put on a slow boiler for a generation, roughly, until the Civil War, the so-called Civil War, which is a dishonest political kind of way of referring to that conflict, because it was not a civil war. Regardless of how you feel about the Confederate States and all of the tangential issues associated with that conflict, the South was not looking to co-opt or take over the government of the North, which would be, by definition, what a civil war is. A civil war is when two contesting sides seek to control the government over the same territory. So, for example, the English Civil War was indeed a civil war, accurately and properly speaking. But the conflict of 1861 to 1865 was an attempt by the South to withdraw consent. You may have heard that term before, the consent of the governed. It's in the Declaration of Independence. It's one of the things we hear about constantly on the 4th of July. The idea that for a government to be legitimate, it must have the consent of those it governs. The South simply wished to withdraw consent. Southerners, through the representatives and through the population at large, viewed the Northern government as no longer being representative, or viewed the government in Washington, I should say, as being predominantly controlled by interests in the North and run for the interests of the North, contrary to the interests of the South. And they therefore wished, I'm going to pass the clover here, I can't pass the clover, they therefore wished to simply withdraw. Now, from a strategic point of view, they made a number of really, really, really poor decisions that played right into the hands of Lincoln and the centralizers in the North. In my opinion, they should have done precisely what the American colonists did during the Revolutionary period, which was attrit the North. They should have simply withdrawn into the South and compelled the North to invade the South and attempt to subdue it and control it, which would not have been popular in the North, and probably the Northern forces would have lost the political support of the people and the movement would have been successful. But this rant is not so much about the war for Southern independence or Southern secession or whatever you'd like to call it. It's about what happened as a result of that. The principle that the consent of the the consent of the governed no longer applied to the individual states, and therefore accordingly it no longer applied to individuals either. You may ask yourself, you should ask yourself, have you given your consent to all of the things that are done to you and contrary to your will, everything from the taxes that you're compelled to pay to the rules that you're forced to obey? Have you actually given your consent, or have you simply been told what you'll do and not do by those who wield political power and control the forces of the government? Obviously, the answer is clear. We've not given our consent. And this notion that you give your consent by proxy to a representative is preposterous. It's, again, a politically dishonest piece of legerdemain designed to obscure rather than illuminate. It's a fundamentally dishonest thing. Unless you as an individual have specifically given your consent to any contract, which is what we're talking about here, you're really not bound by that contract, not in any moral sense. They may compel you legally. But at any rate, as I get into in the column, we are profoundly less at liberty, less free to act, to live our lives than we were in 1776. Obviously, taxes now are ubiquitous and multi-tiered and inescapable, whereas for the most part, people back in the colonial era, back in the 18th century, the average person paid little to no taxes. There was certainly no income tax. A person living in colonial America was free to own his home and his land unencumbered by endless payments to the government in the form of an annual property tax, which renders us fundamentally insecure in our property. After all, if you're compelled to constantly pay to the government in perpetuity for the privilege of being able to occupy your home or your land, you truly don't own it. It's something Americans should consider on this 4th of July. Obviously, you're no longer free to even consume what you wish to consume, to do with your own body, what you wish to do with your own body. And I find it fascinating that the average person is horrified by the idea of chattel slavery, of the idea of owning another human being. But what is it fundamentally when one person asserts control over your physical body, tells you what you may or may not do with your own body, what you may or may not eat, smoke, and so on? Some of you watching this video may draw yourselves back and object about vices, about, oh, it's not good for you, it's not wise, all of which is utterly beside the point. If you own yourself, if no one else owns you, then only you have the right to decide what to do with your own person, with your own body, whether for good or ill, provided you're not hurting anyone else. It is your body fundamentally. You own your physical being, your corpus. But of course you do not in America. So that's another thing to stop and ponder and reconsider celebrating this coming Saturday. We are not free to associate or not associate. We are not free to contract our labor, to work for whom we wish, to hire whom we wish, under the terms and conditions that we wish, voluntarily agree to. All of these things are dictated to us by the federal and the state government and endless streams of officials. We are not free to open a business. We are not free to interact with one another as we wish to. We're not even free to light fireworks if we wish to celebrate what goes on the 4th of July, which is quite ironic. And again, most people don't stop to consider that. So I ask myself, what is it that we're celebrating, and how is it that we are at a fundamental level any more free than, for example, the inmates of a prison like Rikers Island? The people at Rikers Island certainly have a bigger yard, but we also are in the yard, and we also have our guards and our wardens who tell us what we'll do, how we'll do it, and punish us if we don't abide by it. And while that might have been somewhat of a stretch or seeming stretch a few years ago, stop and consider that just like in a prison, all of us now are subject to being randomly stopped and subjected to a physical search of our persons and our effects, just as if you were in a prison and they were shaking down the cell to look for contraband. The difference being that none of us have been charged or even, let alone convicted, of any crime. It's even worse than people in Rikers Island and other prisons who at least have nominally been charged and convicted of some sort of offense, the result of which has been the forfeiture of some of their liberties. Meanwhile, we've forfeited our liberties, or they've been seized from us, without our having even been charged with an offense. Consider that on the 4th of July. At any rate, there is more up at epautos.com, the web's best, I like to think, libertarian-minded gearhead site. I hope you'll stop by and check out some of the stuff that's there, and if you like it, leave some comments. And thank you for watching, and we will catch up with you next time.